Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Okay, so I'm a little raspy. I just got over a cold, so if I'm still having, I promise I'm not contagious, but I'm a little raspy. So if you can't hear me, just raise your hand. I'm just going to introduce our fabulous panel. Thank you, everybody, for coming early in the morning, or not so early, but morning. And thank you very much for our panelists. I'm going to actually first introduce our guest, Dr. Joshua Cowen, who is an associate professor of education policy at the College of Education at Michigan State University. His current research interests include teacher quality, student-teacher mobility, school choice, accountability, program evaluation, and implementation of education policy.
All at once.
Yes. He just received a very large grant from the Arnold Foundation with Catherine Strunk, who many of you know. So congratulations to them. They're going to be working together. That's why he was here, so he was very gracious to offer to come and speak. His work has been published in the American Education Research Journal, Economics of Education Review, Education Evaluation Policy Analysis, Education Finance and Policy, and Education Researcher, the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management.
So you're just taking the same 3 words and rearranging them.
Hey, I School of Education, Sociology of Education, Teacher, College Record, and many others. He's currently the editor for EPA, which many of you know, so we're very fortunate to have him here. Next, many of you knew Dr. Harry O'Neill, who's one of our senior faculty and professor of education psychology and technology at the university here. Currently, he teaches courses in accountability and learning. His research interests include computer-based teaching and 21st century skills, particularly adaptive problem solving and collaboration, or teamwork skills, and the teaching assessment of self-regulation skills, the role of motivation and testing, and training and effectiveness of simulation in games. He is the outgoing editor for AERJ, and he's been on numerous education review boards and editorial boards, very senior faculty. He also, a lot of his work has been with UCLA Crest. And then next we have Dr. Morgan Polikoff, who many of you know is currently an assistant professor in our K-12 policy group. His areas of expertise include Common Core standards, assessment policy, alignment among instruction, standards and assessments, and the measurement of classroom instruction. He uses quantitative methods to study the design, implementation, and effects of standards, assessment, and accountability policies. He is currently the associate editor of AERJ, but has reviewed so many articles and has been on numerous boards as well. And then finally, our moderator, but last but not least, Dr. Gale Sinatra, who's a professor of education psychology. Her interests are in climate science education, evolution education, learning theory, knowledge construction, conceptual change learning, literacy acquisition, assessment, and the public understanding of science. She teaches our motivation courses and learning courses in our EDD and our PhD programs. And she is also a former editor of Education Psychologist.
Educational
Psychologist, yes.
2 different terms.
Oh,
Just like the
psychologist.
words that were rearranged for you.
And has been on numerous boards, associate editor of numerous journals. Was the head of publications for AERA. So, thank you so much.
And you either have me to thank or blame, depending on how you're feeling in this particular day.
So, Gale will be actually moderating the panel, and she has a couple of initial questions, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Okay?
Well, thanks to everybody for coming today. So I thought what I'd do to warm you guys up and get you going on thinking about questions for this amazing panel is just to start asking them an initial few questions. Let everyone answer about their own journal, and then we'll open it up and spend the majority of the time getting your direct questions answered. So the first question I have, and I'm going to start with you, Josh, and then have everybody answer it, is just tell everybody about your journal, and what do you think that they are looking for? What are you looking for in the
So this journal is Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis, or EPA. I am co-editor with 3 others. We have an applied economist, a measurement specialist, and a specialist in teacher quality. And I'm sort of, for better or worse, dabbling in a lot of different areas like this. So I'm sort of more the jack of all trades for the journal. We are, I think it's accurate to say we're the premier policy journal for education in the US. So we're trying to kind of carry the baton for the 3 years that we're there in that sense, which is always the underlying goal. As far as sort of content and the particular things that we as an editorial team, while we're in place for EPA, I think we're always looking for originality. We're looking for questions that are high profile but are under-informed as far as a research base. Heavily empirical, although we do from time to time look at work that's largely theoretical. Certainly we want our empirical work to be well-grounded with respect to theory, but increasingly, for those of you who work in policy, probably are aware, so much of the intellectual back and forth, to put it kindly, and the controversy, to put it less kindly, or debate, really centers on sort of how we think about empirical evidence, and so we really are sort of driven toward asking, toward papers that are asking tough policy questions and are hoping to inform that. And then we would look at work across the spectrum of sort of policy domains. Historically, the journal has always considered work on policy development and to some extent sort of history of policy in the field, and there's still room for that. We don't get a lot of that stuff, and the stuff we do get tends to be some submissions are better than others, but we're certainly interested in that work. It's just not, we don't get a lot of it from the submission standpoint. So.
Thanks. Gary, do you want to tell the group about ARJ and what they are looking for in the manuscript?
Okay, if you could pass these around. What's being passed around is the editorial I wrote that used to be on the website. Of course, you probably know as of July 1, the 2 sections of ARJ. Used to be one on teaching, learning, human development. I was the editor. And there was another one on social and institutional analysis, which had its own editorial team. So the organization decided to collapse those two and bring in a new editorial team. And so one of the things I would suggest, what's being passed around is old news, right? Because it's mine and not the editor anymore. But what I want to do is just briefly go through it, because you ought to chase this information down, because it speaks to the kind of articles and the kind of philosophy that the editor is interested in. And in order to have this editorial, this got approved by the ARA Publication Committee. So it reflects, in a sense, the organization's worldview for at least the years that I was the editor. 20 colleagues, Vanessa was my editorial assistant, so she knows all the good, the bad, and the ugly also. If you look on page 1 called editorial, you see all those bullets. Those are all research topics. So I looked on the website and I couldn't find a new editorial, but eventually it will appear. And so these were issues that I thought were important in order to be a focus of the journal. So if you can find yourself on this list, that obviously improves the probability of getting something accepted. If you turn over to the next page, down the bottom, I also put down there things that if you do these, you get rejected. So this is your final editor list, final edit for your document. You find the equivalent list from whoever the new editors are, and you want to make sure that whatever's on that list, your manuscript doesn't have it. So like for instance, I thought it was important that, given that I've also been interested in technology over the years, that recent literature is referred to older literature. Now the seminal studies, Bloom's taxonomy comes to mind. Does anybody know what publication data that is? Yeah, 1956. So my general rule is never cite anything that's older than you. Right? If you think knowledge is doubling every 2 years, then what Bloom knew versus what we know, and also Anderson et al. In 2001 updated Bloom. So when I say Bloom 1956, I know somebody hasn't done their homework. So that's an automatic reject. Paper comes in, paper goes out. And I had my editorial assistant count the proportion of references that were in the last 10 years. It was a real small number, comes in, goes out, as reject. The other thing which continues to amaze me is we just reject a lot of articles, manuscripts, because they don't follow APA style. And I mean, that's a no-brainer, right? Every APA journal has that as a requirement. You're taught it here, and somehow people just have a, I have no idea what happens in their mind when they submit something that's an APA style. Also, a thing that stands out too is we don't do a good copy editor in your manuscript. And you have typos and you have noun, verb, objects, inconsistent, and all that business. That says to me you didn't proof your manuscript. Then I worry about, well, how well is the research done that you can't even get your manuscript proofed. So to some degree, that stuff goes back out again too. So our overall desk reject was around 50%, but roughly half of that was articles that didn't belong to us. You know, somebody hadn't bothered to figure out there were 2 sections, and they were sending stuff that was clearly belonged to the other section. I actually got an animal study once. You know, those sort of things that don't fit. So I guess I'll stop here, allow other people to talk. I've got some information on desk rejects and also on, what else have I got?
Well, we're coming back around.
Yeah, well, we're coming back around here, okay.
Morgan, you want to
Yeah.
tell people about the journal you're currently?
Sure, although I'm currently an associate editor of AERJ, the new version that is combined. And I mean, he's talked a little bit about AERJ already. I'm also on the editorial board of AERA Open, which I think, like AERJ, is pretty much open in terms of what your paper is about. I mean, especially now that we've combined the sections, it really can be about anything. And primarily, but not exclusively, K-12 education, although we do have some higher ed papers in both journals as well. So I think that it's really less about what your paper is about and more about, is your paper any good? And, you know, I think we'll probably get into what good means, but in large part, good means, to me, that you ask an interesting question, you answer that question in an appropriate way. It doesn't have to be causal, although if it's a causal question, then it should be causal. And then just generally, the paper, you know, is well written and provides sort of a compelling analysis. So the formula is not that complicated, but it's remarkable how many papers right off the bat don't meet that relatively simple formula. I mean, I think 50% is probably on the low end. Because a lot of papers that get sent out for review, I think, could very easily have been desk rejected because of one of those 3 things, right? It's not an interesting or important question. The analysis doesn't at all tie back to the question that was asked, or it's written in a way that you can't really even tell. So I guess that's how I'll start.
So I edited educational psychologists for 6 years, and not a lot of you would submit to that if you're not an ed psych. So I'll just open it up more broadly to non-empirical journals, because writing a non-empirical article is a completely different beast. And then an empirical article, so your standard empirical article has your literature review, your research questions, you know, your methods, your results, and conclusion. That's not the structure of a non-empirical article. And so any non-empirical journal, so that's review journals, or any a journal like ER, Educational Researcher, accepts non-empirical. So any journal that accepts non-empirical or that calls for reviews or non-empirical position pieces is looking for work that presents a coherent, compelling argument. So really it's about constructing an argument and how you do that, and I'll get into that when we get into our next question, but that's really what a non-empirical article is all about, is can you construct a good argument and convince the reader that you have a good argument. Very different from traditional empirical pieces. So that brings us to our second question, and Harry, you already answered some of this question, but I'm sure the other two did as much, and that is, I wanted to ask what specifically makes a winning article in EVA, and what breaks it? I mean, Harry got into what breaks it quite a bit by telling you why you would reject. So what makes or what breaks an article for EVA?
I'll draw a little bit on my last experience too, which was associated in EFP, which is Education, Finance, and Policy, and very similar journals in some sense. I think we play the short answer is it's hard to answer that question broadly because, right, so the rule of thumb for me has been it's hard to overstate the importance of the reviewers themselves, right? And so I think particularly as you're going through the process the first few times with sort of an exchange, or I always think of it as a dialogue with reviewers that I'm moderating. Once it's gone past the desk review or desk editorial stage, and once it goes out for review, then we have to make the final decision as the editors, and there are a number of parameters that guide that. But there's a lot that goes on between the time the paper goes out for review and the time that it's either ultimately accepted or rejected. And for me, the strongest papers, the ones that have the greatest success, are ultimately not only getting into the journal, but then having some impact. So there are other ones that not only take seriously the review, because that's a given. If you don't respond to the reviewer comments and so on, then it's just the process stops. But really sort of engage in it and become, allow the paper to take on really the role that it could, which is a document that is benefiting from peer review, gets stronger throughout the process, and then shows some sort of responsiveness and flexibility to kind of think about the research questions that originated with you, or originated with your perspective on an older literature, but really is again in dialogue with a team of outside experts who are interested enough in the paper to be doing the reviewing. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that I wouldn't think of this as an adversarial process, and the papers that are most successful are the ones that really do take the process seriously, not just in terms of sort of how do I get this into the journal and be done with it, but how do I make this paper better throughout. You can tell the difference between the papers that are really kind of taking reviewer questions and comments as hurdles to jump over, and to some extent they are, but also sort of recognizing that better to be going through this process now than 2 years from now when the paper's out and someone comes and wants you to replicate your data or something. It's very, it's a mutually beneficial process from our perspective, but I think also from the authors, and the papers that fit well into that process are the ones that have the most success ultimately.
So Harry, you talked a lot about what gets a paper rejected from ARJ. What gets one accepted?
I agreed with your philosophy and also yours. We're looking for an original contribution, sort of a wow factor, something that's high quality. It's sort of like saving your best work for the journal, in a sense, because you'll have a lot of things going on. And, the good, the bad, and the ugly in your work. And you want to save the best for these journals because, for instance, ARAJ, the section I edit, has a 95% rejection rate. And Cite Bulletin has, which is an APA journal, has a 97% rejection rate. So you'd have to be mildly suicidal to decide to write a meta-analysis or review of the literature, early in your career, when you're looking at a 97% rejection rate. The Journal of Educational Psychology, which is the other abbreviation, it has an 85% rejection rate. So something that APA does, I think ARA should do, but they don't, which is annually they publish the rejection rates for their journals. So chasing that information down gives you an idea of what the competition is, and it tells you what the level of quality that's got to be in that manuscript. So we're interested in something new and interesting, well thought through, well written. And it's almost like you'll know it when you see it. So we have reviewers, usually 2, 3, or 4 on a manuscript. They make recommendations that come up to associate editors. And the associate editor makes a recommendation that comes up to the editor. So, and if there's a revision, there's another 2 or 3 reviewers. So you could have anywhere from 5 to 8 scholars taking a look at your work and trying to decide whether this is an original empirical contribution or not. So at the end of the day, I think the ones we accept sort of fit that. What's kind of unknown is the ones you reject if they really fit that.
Working? What makes or break an article?
I think the thing that separates winning articles from not winning articles is usually tightness. And tight doesn't mean small, right? Tight could mean that it's a really narrow question and it's trivial. But that's not necessarily, you could be tight around a big question. But the point is that it's a very clear story from beginning to end, right? The question is tied very closely to the research, the sort of setup is tied closely to the research question, like what's the problem we're trying to address here, what's the hole in the literature. The analytic strategy and the data are tied very closely to the research question. The review of the literature is narrow enough to sufficiently say what the contribution is without being so narrow that you have no idea how this fits in the broader literature. The analysis that's done and presented in the results section is what was said was going to be done. And then the discussion is, an appropriate summary of what was done and what the challenges and limitations are. And, offering some, again, how it sort of situates in the broader literature. And it's amazing how many papers fall out all along that chain. I mean, if you just were to take, the 300 papers that were submitted to AERJ and you said, what proportion of them are tight in that kind of way that it's organized, then you're
small.
It's probably 10% or 20%. So then of those, then the question is what percent actually get accepted, and it's a much higher proportion. So I think the thing is that this is a hard thing for even folks who are senior in the field to do, is to write your papers very tightly, is to have a very clear narrative from beginning to end where everything connects, and try and leave as few possibilities as possible for someone to say, well, here are the things that you didn't do. I think that separates, that's by far the most distinguishing feature. And when I'm reviewing, it's very easy to find the lack of tightness in papers. And so I think that's something you should always be thinking about.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, because it's such an important point. And, the issue of tightness and how it sort of becomes operationalized, maybe we can get into later, or just even things like word count and so on, which I know that's not exactly what you're referring to, but I think it's really difficult I don't think you can over-stress how important a well-written, or what an advantage a well-written paper has when it comes in the door. And, of course, well-written is subjective, but clarity really isn't. And, sometimes, especially when you're dealing with heavily empirical stuff, it becomes somewhat self-defeating because often the paper's gone through the ringer through so many different other iterations at the junior level, through advisors, through conferences, that sometimes what ends up getting submitted is this kind of piecemeal document that checks a lot of different boxes, and you've done all these different specification checks and so on, and it's hard to kind of see the paper holistically, but it's also hard to remember that when a reviewer or when an editor gets the paper, they're usually starting from scratch with that paper, unlike maybe something, if it's been something you've been working on for 2 years, and you know it almost in your bones, you know, and as a result, it can get unwieldy. And I mean, I'm supervising a paper right now in the editorial process that by a very, very senior person, and the team of folks, but a very senior person, and there's some basic stuff in there that I think that they did empirically, but, and one of the reviewers suspects they maybe did too, but both of us are sort of, did you do this? We don't know if you've checked this really basic thing. It's not making a lot of sense, and it's not, I'm almost certain that they've done this. It's such an obvious thing that they should have checked for. But nowhere in the paper is it obvious that they actually did it, and that's a prose problem. That's not a statistics problem or an analysis problem more generally. That's just being clear about what you did, and it really, really can save. I mean, I mention this because it has a tangible impact on the paper. I mean, this could be another 4 weeks of process just to say, did you do this, and hear back from them, yes, we did do this. That could be completely removed from the timeline had it just been written clearly in the paper. And it's just really hard to overstate how important that is.
So for
I'm sorry.
So for non-empirical pieces, so non-empirical piece is an essay, a position paper, a model, a lit review, anything like that. So Morgan was saying, tell a good story. With a non-empirical piece, all you have is the story. All you have is the story. So you have to tell a good story. You don't have the data. By definition, all you have is a good story. So you have to tell a good story in a non-empirical piece. And by that I mean you have to introduce the characters. Who are the characters? Maybe there's, two sets of characters, people on one side of an issue, people on another side of an issue. You have to create a dramatic tension. And I'm totally not joking about this. You have to create a dramatic tension. In other words, you have to say, value-added models really work. There's a lot on the line, and read this paper to find out. I mean, not literally, but your paper has to come across with this dramatic tension where you really want to read the paper to find out. Right, so you really have to create that in the way you write it. Hopefully you're actually writing a paper that has that tension already in it. And then you have to have a resolution, right? Like any good narrative, has good characters, there's a dramatic tension, and then there's a resolution. That's a good narrative. What makes a good Hollywood picture, what makes a good TV show, it's the same thing that makes a good non-empirical article. It has this set of characters, there's an interesting problem, and then you create this tension and you resolve it. And it has to be that way because you have to tell a tight story for an empirical piece, but you have no data for non-empirical. And so if you don't have a good story, you don't have anything. What's a good cause, for reject in these journals that are publishing non-empirical work? A good cause for reject is you don't have a good story, you don't have a good argument, or you've submitted it to the wrong journal. So reading what that journal really is interested in and what they want is key, and matching to that journal. And then another thing that people do all the time is their advisor tells them, hey, your lit review you wrote for that paper or your dissertation was a really good lit review. Why don't you submit it? And so people take the lit review out of the dissertation and send it in. That doesn't stand alone. You didn't write it to stand alone. You wrote it to stand as chapter 2 out of 5. It doesn't stand alone. And so if you're going to take a lit review you've previously written for a paper, you have to then go back and make it a good story in and of itself in order for it to fly.
Yeah, the importance of almost like getting it right the first time is really important, because if you submit to an ARA journal or an APA journal, you can't submit that manuscript anyplace else. So you're on a holding pattern of accept, reject until the journal makes up its mind, and the editor makes up his mind or her mind of what they're going to do about it. From the manuscript hitting my desk to a decision being made is somewhere between 6 and 8 months. So that's getting, and I think in the 2 years I was editor, we had 0 manuscripts to get accepted first time. You send it out to scholars, and there's always something to be fixed, usually with good cause. So you're really looking at submitting something, getting feedback, resubmitting it, and going back through the pipeline again. And so if you try to do it too quickly, then you're caught up in more and more time is being spent. And we get letters every once in a while from assistant professors that want to be associate professors. And it'd be helpful to have an article in ARJ. And it's just in the mall. One of your professional responsibilities when you get out is going to be volunteering to review manuscripts, because that's part of what we do. But nobody gets paid for it. So the manuscript comes in, it goes into a conceptual pile, and then how I work is when the editor pings me that says, where's your review? This is after 2 months. Then I get the review back out again. So you could be looking at a year plus for some of these articles. In your case, is that true? I mean, you get an idea of what the lag time is in the journal?
Well, we're trying to tighten that process up a little bit. I know well, both here now at EPA and before at EFP, we were trying to get the reviewers' comments back within 8 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks. That's in the first round. There's always a second round as your, I don't think any of us, we almost always check with the reviewers again after the resubmission comes back in. In a few rare cases, it might be so good that you just sort of realize, or that it's just not going to go any further. But usually the reviewers do a second round. So I mean, I think we try to get the process through, within 12 to 16 weeks. But it really, really depends on the paper and the round and how quick the reviewers really are. I think EPA is not alone, and EFP is not alone. I think in trying to speed up the review process and communicating to the reviewers up front that, there are journals like Educational Policy, just to name one, or EAQ to name another, that are that routinely won't get back to you within 6 to 9 months, even with the first round of reviews, which is frankly just indefensible from an editorial standpoint. And I don't understand why that process is in place. Some of it's disciplinary specific, because that's the tradition, and so you don't feel like. But in policy, at least, getting things quickly can be, I've had stuff submitted myself that by the time it's accepted, we already know, and then this other issue which we didn't even talk about. Where if this paper's been floating around as a working paper first online and so on and so forth, that all these things come into play.
I think what we'll do, since we've been chatting a lot, and I want to turn it over to the students, is we'll break down and open it up for questions from you. You can ask all of us, any of us. General question, specific question. Hold on.
Yeah, I think what are the different kinds of, statuses that can be given? Because I know people get confused between like a rejection with an encouragement to revise versus like a conditional acceptance where it's like, what's the difference? So what's the difference? I don't know if it's different for your various journals.
That's a great
Yeah, reject is the new revise resubmit. That's what I'm seeing. So yeah, do you want to comment?
Yeah, just another editorial assistant with a smart comment, also the current editorial assistant. In theory, there's a category called reject with encouragement to revise. And at one point that meant when the manuscript came back in again, it got an entire new set of reviewers, which means it could be a game change in the tilt on how the manuscript is looked at. And the other category was the accept pending revisions. And the intent there was it's in pretty good shape, but it needs work. And that gets sent out to the original reviewers, so that you've got the same frame on what the revision was rather than something new. And what we request is that you take the reviewer's comments and explicitly, line by line, say how you dealt with them, nor did change it or did something with them. So as the editor, I sort of take all this information in, and I particularly look at whether they were responsive to the reviewer's comments. Because supposedly that's the feedback,
And I would say it's really changed. It used to be really clear, except, nobody got that. Except minor meant there was some minor revisions. Revise, resubmit, that was clear. You were going to go through a few rounds and reject. They didn't want to see it back. But those categories are really fuzzy now, and they differ for different journals. And so if you get a decision letter and you aren't clear what the editor is saying to you, just write to the editor directly and say, what do you mean? Is this going to go back out? Is it going to go back out to the same reviewers? Is it going to go back out to new reviewers? You know, get clarity before you revise, because like Harry says, if you're going to go back out to the same reviewers, then you better address those concerns very explicitly. So you need to know what that decision means, and if you're not sure, just ask.
I don't think there's anything wrong. I mean, you shouldn't ask dumb and obvious questions to editors, but you should ask reasonable questions to editors. And I think that it saves everyone. There's no reason not to, right? It saves everyone time on both ends, and it probably results in a better manuscript that's more likely to get accepted. So.
Yeah, and I mean, we try to be pretty clear in our original decision letters, which specifically, I mean, I take the view that every single word of each reviewer's comments are important and you have to respond to everything. But sometimes there are more important comments than others, and you can, it's fairly clear, or at least we try to make it in our decision letters, where that paper is within that status. I mean, the revise and resubmit is of those categories the kind of the hardest one to interpret, in the sense that because it's the most common one. Well, I don't know, maybe it's not as common as reject, but among the post-reject, right, it's the one that you're going to get, and it's the one that could keep coming back to you. I mean, there could be multiple rounds of revision, and I mean, we reserve conditional acceptance largely for just the paper is done. You know, the type of thing, like sometimes you'll get a review back that says, well, everything's great, I really don't think that they're, you know, I really still think they're going a little bit too overboard in their interpretation of the implications. Can they be a little more cautious in the conclusion, right? And so then you just sort of say, okay, the paper's done, can you add some more sentences right in there? And that's a fairly minor thing, and then we take it back in-house and then just make the final. Revise and resubmit, you should interpret, at least with our journals, is that is unless the editor says otherwise, and I would never say otherwise one way or the other because it keeps things possible. You should assume that it's going back to the reviewers, right? And that means it's another round. I don't like this reject with the encouragement to revise. I think I would rather revise and resubmit. It's a slight difference, but it's a very important one. And you still get these form letters sometimes, I think, from editors. It's like, I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to reject the paper and encourage you to revise it. And then you sort of say, oh, it's a revise and resubmit. That's what I was hoping for.
Yeah, that's why I said reject is sometimes the new revise and resubmit.
Right, right.
I think editors are sort of covering themselves with that so that they don't, like if you, sometimes this happens and it's unfortunate. If you revise and they send it in, they're like, oh, that's what you did? Oh, reject.
Yeah, no.
And that's disappointing for everybody. But that can happen when you get more clarity. You realize there was something actually fundamentally wrong you didn't see before. And so I think when they say reject with an encouragement to resubmit, they're hedging their bets that might happen, that you might make it worse upon resubmission, and they're hedging their bets. But again, just ask.
The other thing I'll add to that too, because Gale mentioned it, that different journals have different, and we work in IPA and I work personally in a fairly interdisciplinary setting, so different disciplines have different ways of interpreting it too. So I do a lot of work with economists, and we get a lot of economists sending stuff to IPA, and most economists interpret, at least straight out economics journals, a revise and resubmit isn't given if the paper's fairly certain to be published. In fact, you'll see people going up for promotion that's not as good as a full publication, but if things are in the R&R process, it's largely very encouraging, right? And you can tangibly use that in a way that certainly, at least in my personal experience, and I know with a lot of other colleagues, that a revise and resubmit isn't buying you a whole lot more than a under review for the purposes of, say, promotion and so on. And so that actually matters, because when you communicate to an economist that this is an R&R, they are interpreting that as, well, this is 98% in, right? And that's not what it means, at least not with IPA. It does mean it's a complete resubmission in that sense, although we will use the same reviewers.
Let's get some more questions from our students. Fred?
I'm curious to know, from the editor's perspective, how you think about really conflicting reviews. I recently received an R&R, like one reviewer loved it and one said it's fundamentally problematic.
What did the editor say?
They said, I think they said this constitutes a minor revision in my opinion, but if you address all of reviewer two's comments,
Then you're home free. So
Yeah.
when you have a
It's gonna be a
conflicting,
different neighborhood.
when you have a conflicting set of reviews, then you have to look at what the editor said. The editor said something there that sounds to me very encouraging and like they're leaning towards the positive reviewer. That said, the negative reviewers, probably some big muck-em-up they don't want to piss off. And as you know, the reviewers get to see, or you may not know, but the reviewers get to see your revision and they get to see your letter to the editor. And so they're going to see that editorial decision letter. So Josh really doesn't want to send a decision letter saying that, Harry, ignore that reviewer, that Harry O'Neill, who cares what he thinks? He doesn't want to do that. That's not smart for him to do. And so what he's saying in that decision letter is do your best to address this person's review, but I'm really favorable. And so what you need to do then is you need to address that person's comments as best you can, and I think make your case in the letter back to the editor. I've won a lot of arguments, not in the paper itself, but in the letter back to the editor, where you say, you know, why you can or you can't address that, or why that's not going to help you to go in that direction. You can often win that argument in the letter back to the editor when you resubmit.
There's also some reviewers that will say accept or accept with revisions, which is a positive sign, and provide no narrative text whatsoever on the rationale for their decision. So then you're left with, you get two reviewers, one saying accept, and it's actually happened, one says reject. And it'd be reasonable for the author to say, well, you know, what's going on here? But when a reviewer provides no text, you don't know what their rationale for either the accept or the reject. And so those are the manuscripts that the associate editors and me spend more time on trying to disentangle that, which takes more time.
Hopefully those people don't get asked to review it.
Yeah, they shouldn't.
It's sort of leading my question of, it's a little off topic, but then what do you look for in choosing your reviewers? Because obviously there's a piece to this of being on the other side of the table that eventually I think most people in this room hope to be in that spot. So what do you look for when selecting your reviewers and sort of their etiquette in working with editors on submission?
It's a really good question. I hope you're all asking your advisors to help you learn how to review. You should jump on reviews with your advisor, and editors usually like that because we want to train the next generation of reviewers. Generally, people are looking for you to identify the strengths and the weaknesses of the article, and to be clear about what those strengths and weaknesses are, and to provide sort of guidance to the author and guidance to the editor. So the guidance to the author is how to fix their weaknesses if they can, and the guidance to the editor that the reviewer is providing is, you know, whether or not it's worth it. Like, can this person pull this off? Like sometimes you see some weaknesses that either structurally can't be fixed, you know, because it's like, oops, you know, you just made a mistake in your empirical work. It's not, there's no fixing it. Or you think it can be fixed, but you don't think this writer can fix it, this researcher can fix it. Like you don't have the confidence that they can do it. So you're providing the guidance to the editor to say, yeah, I think this not only can be fixed, I think this person can fix it. Or it can't. So you're both providing it to the author and to the, and you've got to be clear about that. That's what the editors don't want, is they don't want the reviewer to be wishy-washy about it or unclear, and to give enough detail so they can make those decisions.
And each journal has an editorial board. And so to get on the editorial board, at least for ARHA, you've got to agree to review 6 manuscripts per year. And the editorial board is approved by the ARA publication committee. So you might say, well, where does the editorial board come from? The way I put it together is I decided who I wanted to be associate editors. People you have confidence in and in judgment. So Robert Rader, for instance, on faculty is one of the associate editors. Radesh Tynes is one of the associate editors. And they represent different communities. I mean, for the purpose of this journal, Robert, for instance, I hadn't painted with motivation. So I asked each of the associate editors in turn to submit lists to me of who they think would be good reviewers. And I picked my list because I personally knew everybody on the list, or I was aware of their work. And in my own mind, I had good, bad. What you don't know is the new role of being a reviewer, whether in fact they're going to take that seriously. So the things that kills us, or at least killed us, somebody says yes and does nothing. And you need at least 2 reviews to make the whole thing work. So it takes a while to figure out nothing's happening. And then you gotta go out and get another reviewer. And that reviewer needs 4 to 6 weeks or whatever the amount of time you're giving them. So there's an enormous amount of delays in
Let me
this.
get Morgan in here. You've won a couple of awards for reviewing. What do you think makes a good review?
Well, the way that, as I understand it, the way that they choose those awards is mostly based on time. So I'm, so.
I don't think that's the only reason. What do you think makes a good reviewer?
No, what I think makes a good reviewer is, it's kind of the obvious thing that, it's tautological, right? You're a good reviewer because you're a good reviewer, because you identify the things that need to improve in the manuscript. You can identify, strengths and weaknesses, you can report, you can say them in a way that's not like obnoxious. You do it relatively fast. I think that some reviewers like dwell on things that are frankly kind of stupid. It's worth mentioning that they need to address their APA format, but it's not worth spending like 3 paragraphs on that and then not at all discussing the empirics. So. Those are kind of the sort of obvious things. I think being honest about, at least this is what I would look for in a reviewer if I was selecting a reviewer, someone who's honest about what are the deal breakers and what are not the deal breakers. Like you shouldn't say to an editor, yes, this should be an R&R, and yes, I'm willing to revise it, to review it, if you have a 0% probability that you would ever say accept on this paper. So I think you should be honest about what are the chances. And sometimes I'll say to reviewers, to editors, because you write a letter to the authors and you write a letter to the editor, I'll say, I don't think this paper should ever be accepted, and I don't think you should ask me to review it again because I'm not going to change my mind. I assume that that's helpful. Maybe it makes me sound like a jerk, but I think that that kind of thing would probably be useful.
Yeah, and I would add to that too, for some of the, I think all of these journals have, what they do have in common is that they have fairly wide sort of scope and breadth and the sort of the types of stuff coming in. So often just getting substantive expertise from the reviewer is really important because as many different literatures and subliteratures as we like to think that we know about as editors, the reality is sort of identifying what may seem like a major contribution because it's an interesting paper and an interesting question may actually not be as unique in the field if you're sort of really got your ear to the ground. And that's so asking a reviewer to kind of weigh in on that. When in doubt, honestly, we will often go to the reference list of the paper if we're really having a hard time. And so particularly for papers that are really heavily cited. So if you're sitting there and saying, well, I'm following off of Polikoff's work on this, and if you do that for 3 or 4 pages, Morgan's getting asked to review it. And that's a very common, in part because I don't want him to come back and say, but he could also be working on something else that's very related, but also just sort of that's a very straightforward way to find somebody. We I think all have had a very hard time. Frankly, getting senior reviewers, and so I always try to find a mix of experience. You get different types of reviews from junior and senior people for the most part. And this is a gross overgeneralization, but the types of reviews that I often expect from very senior people are sort of comprehensive and sort of thematic, often sometimes very detail-oriented, but also often sort of placing the piece in a wider debate or in the wider literature, whereas you can rely on some of the more junior folks, particularly those who have been out for a little while, but still there to really burrow in, and this is a journal-specific thing, to really burrow in on the model you're estimating, to complain about the standard errors or something like this, right? But the types of stuff you need to know. I also expect that the junior people tend to get back to you a lot faster, which is nicer, frankly. And we've had this larger issue with both the journals I've been in now of really trying to get, the senior people just don't do it, and it's a real problem.
Retired.
What's that?
Retired.
Don't go retired instead of...
No, we're tired.
Well, Be that as
And
it
I'm looking
may.
forward to retirement, but not retirement. Well, I mean, I used to count how many I did a year, and for the 6 years I was editor, I did 50 a year. And that's a lot. That's,
Yeah.
you're
Oh
doing
my
one a
God.
week, and you do get kind of burnt out on it. And I think that's why we're losing a lot of the senior people, which is why I hope junior people
But the
continue
closer-
to review.
The closer the paper is to that reviewer, junior or senior rank, to their own personal wheelhouse, the easier the review is for them, but the more valuable it is to you too. So I mean, we all have an incentive to get it to the people that have a very close identification intellectually with the paper you've got. I mean, it works better for you and it works better for us. And that works most of the time.
Back to our students for more questions. Fred?
And then one related to the, how do you deal with like the working paper issue, like on NBER? Several papers, even like that have been in EPA, have already been in NBER on circulation. That, and then also, do you ever try to identify who it is, who the authors are? Because you can kind of tell sometimes who they're not citing and the right
You know.
author.
Oh, editors
We
always
yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry. So maybe when you're reviewing papers.
So start with the working document, the working paper issue.
Well,
You're familiar with this issue?
yeah, of course.
Okay.
So we don't have, and I don't know, maybe ARA actually has ARA has guidelines for everything that I'm not 100% aware of. I have to admit, there's a handbook. We don't have a particular disincentive to not publish a paper just because it's been out. It's certainly on an NBR. Where it gets trickier is when something's been floating around in a sort of a, NBR is a specific case because it goes, there's kind of a process, it's not
NBR,
peer
someone
reviewed.
doesn't
What's that?
In case someone doesn't know what's
That's the
in.
National Bureau of Economic Research, so you'll see a lot of policy-oriented papers come out on that working paper series. But we all, one of these top-line working paper series, we kind of know what that is, and it's not published, but it's been there. And where it gets trickier is where you'll sometimes see these papers come out in abbreviated form as like a policy brief, where it really kind of is published. So, I mean, working papers, clear and unambiguous working papers, we will publish. Stuff that's sort of been out in a different form, we generally would shy away from. There was a second question that I actually had an answer to, but I can't
That was
remember.
It's about,
should
Identification.
Uncovering.
do reviewers try to figure out who the authors are? Of course.
I mean, I think that
Of course they do.
a lot, I mean, first
But
of
they're
all,
often wrong.
it should be irrelevant. Second of all, a lot of the time you're just gonna know because you know, particularly if it's something that's in your wheelhouse, then, I mean, I don't think that you should go Googling it unless you really feel compelled to do that. But again, I don't think that it should matter who the author is.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't had a blind peer review of my work in 15 years. I mean,
Right.
there's
Well,
no way I've
EFP
submitted anything where people don't know it's
isn't
me.
even
So, I mean,
blind
that went out the
on
window a
that,
long time ago.
Right, and the EFP actually single blind now, so the reviewers know who the submitter is. It's just because of that, and a lot of econ journals have gone this way because
Yeah.
they just
Like, why
been
have
out
the
for a while.
pretense, yeah.
But as a reviewer, yeah, sometimes you do try to think of who it is, but it's funny because you're often wrong.
So
You're often wrong.
The one thing I will say just mechanically, because sometimes it's the mechanics that are most helpful, right, is we have, and this is from SAGE and from ARA, we have this policy that the paper as submitted has to be completely blinded, or else that's not even desk reject, that's sent back before it even comes to the editor. And we've tried to kind of tweak that a little bit to meet the spirit, not the letter, since
Yeah.
we've been there, because what ends up
It's
happening.
obnoxious.
Yeah, well, what ends up happening is if you've been working on a team, particularly for a while, if you've been working with someone a little more senior, anybody who's qualified to review the paper, if you're citing your own stuff, for example, in the narrative, and then you sort of author redact it, right, then you're screaming to the
Who it is,
reviewer
you're almost-
who it is.
It's almost more revealing
That's
than
right.
leaving it in.
That's
yeah.
right. And so what we've sort of said to people when this comes up at least once a week is, if you can write the paper cognizant of that up front, that you're going to have to redact it in a way, but also maybe rather than referring to sort of in previous studies we did this, or in the earlier part of this, and now this is the extension to that work we did this. The more you can kind of refer to it in the third person, we won't ding it just because your name or your co-author's name is on there. Technically we're supposed to, but that just makes it even worse. So if it's written in a way that blinds it, we'll let it go through, even though technically if it's got your name on it anywhere in the document, it's supposed to be out. That these days it just doesn't, it just makes it easier to identify. But just preparing the manuscript, that's a good thing to try to remember up front.
So I'm really of a mind that I would never put a working paper out there ever. Because what you're doing is you're giving away your stuff for free, is the way I would look at it. So that's my bias. I mean, if you can publish something, then why would you put it on the web before you publish it? I mean, I think that's really, really risky. That's just my own personal perspective. Ty, did you have a question?
Yeah, I feel like as being on the editorial board for all of you, have you seen papers where it's almost like the person is trying to write to specific editors or associate editors by like constantly citing them in different work to kind of push their paper toward being reviewed by certain people? Have you seen that as a common practice, or I guess what do you think about it as editors?
This is like sort of a really sort of inside baseball thing that people are doing a lot of now, and in some ways you should do it, and then at some point it goes too far and into shady areas of perhaps inappropriateness. But you really shouldn't submit to a journal you haven't looked at the editorial board of. I mean that makes sense. You should look at the editorial board and see who they are, because obviously those are the people who review the manuscript, and that's your check on the fit. If you're not connecting to that literature that they write in, then you're not. You've got the wrong journal. So it makes sense to do that. And in some cases, it makes sense to then cite those people, particularly if their work is, obviously relevant and supporting what you're doing. But then there's a point where it goes over to the not as appropriate side, where you're sort of pandering to the review board, and you obviously don't want to do that.
I've never in my life looked at who the editors of a journal were and used it to shape the manuscript in any way, but I could see that would be useful if you thought that, like, in your area, you wanted to make sure that, like if Bill Schmidt was the editor of a journal, like I would have to cite Bill Schmidt. I mean, I always cite Bill Schmidt, but if I was writing something that was relevant to Bill Schmidt's work and he was the editor and I didn't cite him, then that would be all the more egregious. I mean, it's bad enough if you get a reviewer, but if it was the editor, then but otherwise, I've never personally done that.
Where I've done it a little bit, and this is my own work, but and I do see it sometimes. I mean, you get it's not so much citing the editors. The reality is, if you're writing, the lit review should be written because it's the right lit review to have.
Absolutely.
If it turns out you're working in the area that a journal editor or potential reviewer, assuming a reviewer is going to be in that field, then it should reflect them. But where you do get into some tough spots is sometimes when you're working, so I work in a lot of controversial areas, and these debates aren't settled. And so if you're writing and you know that there's a chance that the editor, who has also written on this or has an opinion about it, because everybody's on blogs now and so on, so I study charter schools for one thing, so I'm not going to write a paper that says, the debate on charter schools is settled and we've got positive results across the board, and then submit it to EPAA, which is largely a fairly sort of anti-reform oriented journal. It's just not going to happen. So you do have to sometimes be.
It's about fit.
It is about fit, but it's also, doing your job as a writer also can alleviate that problem, because it wouldn't be accurate to have written what I just wrote, what I just said anyway. So, but
That's true. I do wonder, because I'm editing a issue of ADRA Open about Common Core, and I'm probably, for people who think about these things, seen as someone who's relatively pro-Common Core. So I do wonder if folks who submitted abstracts to that thought about that in their submission process. I don't know the answer to that. I tried very, very hard to be as neutral as possible about, again, it was like cases where it was really egregious, like if it was about like Common Core is the corporate reform machine and Bill Gates cramming his agenda down our throat. I'm like, you shouldn't have written that anyway, but also because it's me, I find that particularly objectionable. But I think, again, if you write thoughtfully, you're not going to make those kind of mistakes.
Another question, yeah?
It's a slight sidestep, but looking towards the future, if you could speak to, you said you're on AERA Open and other open access journals, maybe like thoughts and feelings, cite them, don't cite them, submit to them, don't submit to them.
In 10 years, there's not gonna be anything but open access journals. So that's we're all going out of business in terms of the affordability of the print medium for journals. And so they just cost too much, too expensive, they're too expensive for libraries. And so, everyone is eventually gonna switch over, and there might be maybe a handful of the premier ones that people are still willing to pay for, but it's just the overwhelming majority of journals are going to be open access in the future. So in that way, we're gonna have to get used to it. And it's gonna change a lot about the way the journals are perceived in tenure and promotion, so they're still not
Right, yes.
perceived particularly positively by old people like me, because we're kind of suspicious of the whole thing, maybe for some good reasons. But over time, there's going to be open access journals that will gain enough of a reputation that they will be, more valued. As a junior person, I would say you would be absolutely nuts to publish everything in open access between now and tenure, because you're just putting yourself at risk. But I would also say that it is not inappropriate at all for a junior person to have a portfolio approach to publishing, where they have the top journals, traditional in their field, and open access, a blog post, and piece in Huffington, to have that sort of eclectic profile is really more typical of a junior profile for people today.
There's also the promotion and tenure process. That usually there's a departmental review, and then there's a school review. We don't have any departments in Rossier, so it's only one review. And you have to have the rank equal to or greater than what you're being reviewed, the person you're reviewing. So assistant professors are reviewed by associate full, associate professors are reviewed only by full. Other things being equal, the more you go up that ladder, the older you're getting. And so it's got to be, there's a value statement in there someplace, prints better than open access, because it's really peer reviewed, it's really high quality. But then it goes to the university level. And I would bet 99% of the people sit on those panels, because you don't get to sit on the highest level tenure panel in the university unless you're very senior and your judgment is respected by the provost and the president and all that kind of stuff. And I'd bet money at that level that you want to be in print journals rather than the open access stuff.
I think I understand the, I totally get why people are into open access and democracy of knowledge and all that. I think some people die on that sword when they don't have to. I mean, I see people on Twitter who, they're assistant professor somewhere, they're really committed to this, they publish in only certain kinds of it's usually not just like AERA Open. AERA Open is different from some fly-by-night open access online journal. They publish in these very narrow open access journals because that's what they're committed to, and then they get counseled out, or they don't get tenure, or they just leave because everyone says you're not going to get tenure. So that's a challenge. For better or worse, the name of the journal is taken as a symbol of the quality of your work. And so even if you believe in open access, you should publish some stuff in open access, but you gotta publish some stuff in journals that people think these are good journals.
I mean, I can't think of a paper, and we're sitting on these boards of some of the sort of top journals in the country, so it's not, maybe the gap is inappropriately wide for this. I mean, the harder thing is when you're talking about kind of a lower tier print journal versus open access. And the trade-off really might be, so increasingly, and every institution is different, and every subfield is different, and depending on who the writers are, I mean, this issue of getting your stuff distributed and out there beyond impact factor, some institutions are big impact factor places, others are much more sort of qualitatively, did you make your mark, is it well cited, do people know who you are? Is there a lot of the tenure and promotion process at most major universities is not well, at least in education, is not well aligned with sometimes with what sort of dean's external priorities are. So for example, and I have a good relationship with my dean, but we have a very typical traditional tenure and promotion process at MSU, top journals, top grants, things like this. But then, well, when we get a big grant, the dean's on Twitter talking about it. But when we get a hit at EPA or at ARJ, that doesn't go out on the press release. What goes out on the press release is if the Washington Post covers your working paper, or if the Detroit Free Press, even a local, the biggest paper in the state for me, or the state superintendent mentions you in a speech. So that all goes in, and how that fits, it's a different topic entirely, but it's actually more salient in my view than some of the work that open access trade-off stuff. Because for the most part, you're not going to be saying, well, should I go to EPA or should I go to ARA Open? It's usually, I've got a paper, I've had a hard time getting it fit, nobody's taking it. I'm sorry, I know this isn't the way it's supposed to work, but ARA Open, at least it's out there somewhere. It's better than having it die in my hard drive, right?
Yeah, I will say that I personally, and I'm on the editorial board of AERA Open. I think it's not going perfectly, but I would definitely submit a paper to AERA Open before I would submit a paper to education policy, because the publishing process of education policy is horrendous, and I don't think the editors are very good, and it would be a terrible waste of my time. Whereas I know AERA Open is like bam, bam, fast because I'm on the other side, and even if I think maybe the open access thing is maybe not so good and they don't have an impact factor yet, but it's also an AERA journal, and there is a little bit of cachet that comes with that. So that would be a no-brainer for me. So I think it's not, as he said, it's not about like, do I submit an AERJ or some questionable online open access only journal. It's more, when you're not at the top tier and you're talking about a sort of lower tier sub-disciplinary journal or an open access.
Yeah, can I just one more follow-up on sort of all this too is it really, I'd say 3/4 of the stuff that I've ever published, the suggestion for the outlet that eventually landed in came from someone else. I mean, rarely was it, certainly most of my stuff is with other people, so you decide this as a team. But rarely you're sort of you're driving down the street and you sort of say, EPA is a good fit for this. You talk to people, you can write to the editor and ask about it, but you can say, you go to a meeting, you talk to someone who read it at a conference, and so I'm thinking about submitting this, where would be a good place? I mean, talk to your advisor at minimum. I mean, it's not, you don't have no knowledge to sort of make this decision, right? And that can help a lot.
So we've only got about a couple of minutes left, so we can maybe take one more question. Well, Robert.
I have a couple of things that more from an associate dean perspective that I have about a month's experience in. But I assume most of the people here are here because you want to go into an academic position. So the whole journal thing is, if you get to a top tier institution, that's probably 90% of what they look at. But I think one thing is the choice of journals, because we say journal as if it's one thing, but they range all the way from some that are very wide to some that are very specialized. And so when you think about where you send it to, that's a really crucial decision.
And I think you should think about that as you're in the process, right?
Right,
Not just
right.
you write the paper
Right.
and then you're like, where do I send it? Because you should shape it.
The other thing, having been on a lot of editorial boards, the significance is really important. So when you write to an audience, you really have to convince them why this topic is important, because take a journal like AERA, you have tons of people from different areas different than your own. You have to convince those people why should this be of interest, not to just a small circle of people that you typically write for, but to a much wider audience. Another thing is reviewing many articles. One of the things, we talk about automated knowledge, which means there's a lot of stuff we know that we're not really aware of. So when you've been working in an area for so long, you sort of take things for granted, and when people write articles, a lot of times they make connections in their mind that they don't put down explicitly on paper. So when you get it as an editor or reviewer, you don't necessarily see all the steps. It was clear to the person writing it because they're so immersed in the work. And when you do programmatic research, you're going to be in the same area for a long, long time. And so you really have to step outside and say, I'm writing for somebody that doesn't know why this is important, how these things link together. And that's a good reason for rejection too. And finally, the last thing, rejection, it's probably like dating. If you get rejected, you have to sort of pick yourself up and go on. But there's a lot of reasons for rejection, so it doesn't mean throw this away. It could mean it wasn't appropriate for this journal. It could mean it'd be not so good here, but really good for a more specialized journal or for a different publication venue. So rejection is not just rejection. There's a lot of different reasons for it. So it's worth it to really take a look at what the editors tell you. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad paper, throw it away, don't. But they tell you there's a fundamental flaw in your research design you can't fix. You know, that's one thing. Go back to the drawing board. But if they say, this is a really good paper, but probably not the best fit for this audience, or something like that, then you have a lot of different options. So sometimes it's just a question of fit and not necessarily the quality.
I know we're out of time, but just since this has been something I've been dealing with this week, if you do get a rejection, it's absolutely true. Go pick yourself up, go to another journal. But if there's stuff you can fix from those reviews that you can do fairly straightforwardly without completely reinventing the wheel and losing 7 months on the process, you should address them, because it is not at all unlikely that the same reviewer might get asked for the other journal, and nothing drives reviewers crazier than getting the paper 3 weeks later and you haven't touched any of their suggestions, and then they tell you, and then that is a big ding on the second journal too. If there's think of the reviews as positive. Fix what you can fix before you send it back out, because it happens unfortunately more common than.
My last shot across the bow for advice would be never submit anything to a journal that you haven't had at least 2 people read and give you feedback on before you send it in, because then you're just sort of going one level up the food chain of review, right? You've already had a reviser submit from colleagues, from peers, and the advisor, and so the chances of your manuscript, moving up that review food chain is better if you've done that. So never submit anything cold. All right, thanks, everybody.